My name's Andre Gunawella. Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. Folks, as I'm sure you know, you've been watching the news. We've seen a lot of escalation in the Middle East. A few weeks ago, we heard about the pager attacks targeting Hezbollah operatives. I think last week we saw the death of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and the elimination of a lot of Hezbollah's command structure by the Israeli armed forces. And just yesterday, today is also Wednesday afternoon that I'm recording this, but just yesterday we saw the Iranian ballistic missile attacks on Israel, and just this conflict really escalating in the Middle East. So I wanted to do an episode sort of profiling Hezbollah, this Lebanese militant group, and I thought it would be great to have Dr. Matthew Levitt join me. He is a great expert on Hezbollah. Matt is the former Wexler Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and the director of its Janet and Eli Reinhardt program on counterterrorism and intelligence. He has served in multiple government roles focusing on terrorism, and he has authored several books, including Hamas, Politics, Charity, and Terrorism in the Service of Jihad, Negotiating Under Fire, Preserving Peace Talks in the Face of Terror Attacks, and perhaps the most relevant book for this particular episode, Hezbollah, The Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. He is also the host of a great podcast series called Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule. So while this episode will be a primer on the burn bag on Hezbollah, I strongly recommend you go read the book and you listen to his podcast to learn a bit more. Matt also maintains interactive maps of Hezbollah's international activities and of Iran's external operations. So Matt, there probably isn't anyone better than you to talk to about Hezbollah. So thank you so much for joining me here today.
So great to be here. I couldn't have asked for a better introduction than that if my mother was introducing me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Try to do my research before. And yeah, I mean, you have a really incredible resume. I mean, focusing on these terror groups. And my mentor, Javed Ali, who used to be senior director of counterterrorism on the NSC, really urged that I speak to you about this topic. So, much appreciated.
Well, I feel seen, but anything Javed told me about you, I deny. About me, I deny.
Thanks. So anyway, sort of getting, right into it, Matt, what is Hezbollah? Is it a terror group, a religious organization, or a political party? Or is it all of the above?
Yes, it is all of the above. And that is one of the most significant and important things to understand as to why it's so successful and why it's so complicated and adversary to deal with. Anybody who tells you that Hezbollah is only a terrorist group or an extremely capable militia has got it wrong. They're also a political party. And whether you like them or you don't like them, they are a political party in Lebanon where Hezbollah is not any legal organization. They are a social welfare movement. They run medical clinics, hospitals, schools, an environmental organization, a demining organization, food programs. They are a religious organization. They're all of these things, and they do all of these things together in such a way that each set of activities helps the other. And when it comes to Hezbollah, they go to great lengths to publicize the stuff they want you to know about, their overt activities, medical clinics in the schools, politics, what have you, and go to equally great lengths to make it difficult for people to identify and understand their covert activities. That, by the way, is the meaning behind the title of the podcast, Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule. There was a Hezbollah operative here in the United States who was ultimately convicted on all counts in New York, Ali Karani. And at one point, he was telling the FBI about what he described as his sleeper cell activities. I don't really like the term. It sounds too Hollywood, but he used it. And the FBI asked him, under what circumstances do you think you might be called upon to act on the pre-operational surveillance you've been conducting here in the United States over the course of the years? And he said, well, maybe if there's a war with Iran, maybe if Nasrallah is killed, which kind of brings us to today. But they also, he also told them that he once asked his handler, a more senior Hezbollah operative, about his handler's role in some Hezbollah operations abroad. And the handler said, no, the golden rule of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, its terrorist wing, sometimes referred to as Unit 910, the golden rule is the less you know, the better. So in the podcast, we're trying to break that rule. And they go to great lengths to make it difficult to understand their covert activity, the international terrorist activity, the international illicit financial criminal activity, the militia activity. And that is now being unwound, not completely, but in very large part by a series of Israeli actions over the past just 2 weeks that really come out of a Hollywood script.
No, absolutely. And I mean, the pager attacks and then, I mean, the killing of Nasrallah, I mean, really takes you aback, I think, in many ways. But I mean, you mentioned a little bit about Hezbollah's role as a political entity, as almost a civic entity. I mean, you mentioned food banks, for example. So, I mean, like, what is the nature of Hezbollah's actual political influence in Lebanon? I mean, like, does it completely control parts of Lebanon? And like, does it engage in types of governance, almost like a separate state in some ways, or is it a bit different?
So I've written about Hezbollah's shadow governance. Hezbollah operates like it is the government, like a shadow government in Lebanon, especially for the people it considers to be its constituents, primarily the Shia communities in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shia organization, but also for Christian and other communities that have allied with it or are located in areas that are especially important to it, like southern Lebanon. It uses its social welfare activities as a way of building grassroots support and indebtedness for the organization. There is a very large segment of the Shia population in Lebanon that will support Hezbollah no matter what, are crushed, really crushed that Nasrallah was killed. Don't believe that Hezbollah has engaged in any of the international terrorist or other illicit criminal activities we've discussed. That's all just an American Zionist conspiracy, and you won't change their mind. There are others that are less ideologically supportive of Hezbollah, but support Hezbollah because they benefit from Hezbollah's largesse. Here I should note, by the way, that Hezbollah's just better at this than other political entities in Lebanon, but Lebanon is a deeply divided sectarian community, and it's run by political dons, mafia bosses, who like to be able to have their fiefdoms and to be able to trickle down benefits and salaries to their supporters. And it explains why the political reform that the international community has demanded of Lebanon in order to get the massive economic aid that it needs has been so difficult to do. Hezbollah is a part of that, but they're not the only ones. There is space in Lebanon that Hezbollah ultimately controls, whether it's the Dahya neighborhood in southern Beirut, parts of southern Lebanon, or the Bekaa Valley. Hezbollah literally has closed military zones that are Hezbollah closed military zones, not the Lebanese armed forces. It just decided this. This is not something that the Lebanese government decided. And ultimately, you have a situation where Hezbollah is doing things in and around heavily populated areas, using those civilians, whether they want to or not, as human shields, and making decisions of life and death, war and peace for all Lebanese, though it is not an elected body. They have people who are members of parliament, and together with their Christian allies, they have a blocking third in the parliament, so they get to decide what legislation passes and what doesn't. And they have members who are ministers or deputy ministers, but they themselves are not part of the government. They are part of and apart from the governance in Lebanon all at the same time.
So, what is the nature of Hezbollah's actual relationship with the Lebanese government? I mean, you talked about how they have seats in the legislature, they have sort of coalitions with other political parties. But I mean, like, this is such an interesting thing to understand, especially for some of the casual watchers who've only really known Hezbollah as, launching the missiles from Lebanon into Israel and being one, that militant group that's part of that Iranian-backed axis of resistance. But I mean, has Hezbollah come into conflict with the Lebanese government? Do they cut deals with the Lebanese government? I mean, what is the nature of that relationship?
In a word, complicated, because yes, they cut deals with the Lebanese government. They have their people who participate in Lebanese government and take their marching orders from Hezbollah. They have parliamentarians in the parliament. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah has demonstrated through deed, not just word, that when push comes to shove, if the Lebanese government tries to assert sovereign authority over things that Hezbollah wants control over, Hezbollah will turn its guns that are supposedly for the quote unquote resistance against Israel against fellow Lebanese. In 2008, Hezbollah took over downtown Beirut by force of arms, used their weapons against fellow Lebanese. When the government of New Zealand designated the military wing of Hezbollah as a terrorist group, it cited this as an act of terrorism against fellow Lebanese. The government was trying to prevent Hezbollah from collecting intelligence and having its own cameras at the Beirut International Airport, and trying to prevent Hezbollah from running their own fiber optic cable lines for their own independent telecommunications system. And Hezbollah would have none of it. Hezbollah also has an assassination unit, Unit 121, whose sole purpose is to assassinate fellow Lebanese with whom it disagrees. That can be intellectuals like Luqman Slim. It can be senior politicians like the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, and a whole bunch of other people in between. At the end of the day, I think a lot of people nowadays in Lebanon are very, very wary of Hezbollah outside of their core support base, of course, because they see Hezbollah making decisions that are in its own and in Iran's interests much more than or even contrary to those of the Lebanese people. So intimidating bankers and forcing them to accept Hezbollah money that are the proceeds of criminal enterprises that undermine the Lebanese financial system, they're worried about that. And look at the designations of the Lebanese Canadian Bank and Jamal Trust Bank, for example, assassinating fellow Lebanese, dragging Lebanon into potential war right now because of a war of choice that Hezbollah decided to do without consulting anyone else in Lebanon on October 8th, the day after the Hamas October 7th massacre, where it decided to start attacking Israel in support of Hamas, and has carried out near daily rocket attacks against Israel for 11 and a half months. And I think a lot of people in Lebanon are extremely concerned about that, especially as it comes on the heels of not just the political crisis, which really does come down a lot to Hezbollah and its unwillingness to compromise on who can be president, but much more importantly, the economic crisis in Lebanon. There is a serious, serious economic crisis going on in Lebanon, and Lebanese understand that even if Hezbollah can inflict tremendous damage on Israel in a full-scale war, and I think they still could, that Israel would inflict tremendous damage on Lebanon. And nobody but maybe the most hardline people in Hezbollah want that right now.
So, I mean, it sort of sounds like the Lebanese government is sort of de facto hostage to Hezbollah. And what about relations with the military? Like, is the Lebanese military sort of essentially powerless, and even if they wanted to, stopping Hezbollah? What is that? I mean, I'm just trying to understand this relationship better, I guess, because it's so interesting, does Hezbollah sort of de facto, do they have people in the official Lebanese military, for example, that sort of call the shots?
So you're right to be honing in on this question. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that de facto, the Lebanese government is hostage to Hezbollah. Early on in this conflict, I think it was on CNN, one of the acting senior leaders in Lebanon was asked by a journalist, so, Hezbollah is now shooting rockets into Israel on a near daily basis. Is there going to be a war between Lebanon and Israel? And he pauses and looks in the camera and says, don't ask me. You need to ask Hezbollah. So Hezbollah does have members and supporters in the Lebanese armed forces. It does not control the Lebanese armed forces. Because the Lebanese armed forces are considered by everyone to be kind of the glue that holds society together, they're the one national element that includes members from all the sectarian communities. You'll have Shia working in the LAF, the Lebanese armed forces, who are not Hezbollah supporters, and you will have some who are hardline Hezbollah supporters. Separate from that, at the end of the day, the reality is that Hezbollah has a bigger militia, a better armed militia, a better trained and far more committed militia than the Lebanese armed forces. And so the Lebanese armed forces have never been willing to exert force against Hezbollah, in part because pretty much everyone except for Hezbollah in Lebanon has been very, very wary of doing anything that could lead to another Lebanese civil war. People are still very, very scarred by that for good reason, but also because they understand that they probably would get beat.
So, I mean, we talk about that quite a bit. We talk about a lot of the concerns within Lebanon about Hezbollah, but they still have seats in the legislature. So, like, I mean, how does the public perceive Hezbollah? I mean, like, what is the nature of actual popular support for the organization?
I can't give you numbers, certainly not right now as everything's in flux. But the fact of the matter is that when I say that Hezbollah has a blocking third in the parliament, it's not predominantly because of Hezbollah members of parliament. There aren't that many. It's because of their coalition with Christian parties.
Interesting.
At the
Christian
end of the day,
parties.
yes. So not all Christian parties, but some Christian parties. And at the end of the day, like I said, you have a significant portion of the Shia community that is very, very much behind Hezbollah. You have others in the Shia community, and anecdotally, it seems that this is growing, who are not Hezbollah supporters. And when I mentioned intellectual Luqman Saleem, who was assassinated by Hezbollah, he was a Shia. I think right now, unlike in 2006, the last war between Israel and Hezbollah was in 2006. And unlike at that time, when there was a lot of circling of the wagons, not just within Lebanese society, but across the Middle East, Shia, Sunnis, etc., behind Hezbollah for, kind of Hezbollah's, they declared divine victory, the first Arab army to stick their finger in Israel's eye and to survive, to win by not being destroyed. There was a lot of circling of the wagon behind Hezbollah. You're not seeing that now. And if, God forbid, there is a full-scale war, then I don't think you're going to see that then either. Because as I said, really nobody in Lebanon wants this. And they see Hezbollah dragging the country into a war of choice that they don't want.
So let's take a step back into history. What was the impetus for Hezbollah's formation? Like, what incited that group to form? Why did it form? When did it form, etc.?
So Hezbollah was founded in 1982, though it only formally acknowledged its existence with an open letter in 1985. For many years, Hezbollah denied that it existed before 1985, and that was important for the group because then it could deny responsibility for carrying out the Beirut bombings in the early 1980s, targeting the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. Marine Barracks, French peacekeepers, then the U.S. Embassy Annex. At the time, it was carrying out those operations under the cover name Islamic Jihad Organization. That is still the name that they use for their terrorist wing. But over time, as Hezbollah got older and as the anniversaries of these attacks circled around, Hezbollah leaders got sloppier in their denials and would talk about, well, don't make us do those types of things again. Remember what we did. And meanwhile, the U.S. government, the German government, and others have issued unclassified or declassified reports where they document quite closely the fact that this actually was Hezbollah just operating under cover names, and then it only officially launched itself under the name Hezbollah in 1985. There were two things that led to this formation in 1982. One was the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon in an effort to push out Palestinian terrorist groups who had come to Lebanon from Jordan after being kicked out of Jordan, were operating as a state within a state in Lebanon, much as Hezbollah does to a much greater degree today. And Shia militias popped up to fight against the Israeli military occupying this swath of southern Lebanon. They were mostly a bunch of motley crew Shia groups that were not so coordinated together, and they were breaking apart from one another. The most important group at the time was Amal, and it was insufficiently Islamic and insufficiently close to the new revolutionary regime in Iran for some. And so there's a breakaway called Islamic Amal, which lasted a very short period of time because Islamic Amal quickly morphed into what we now know as Hezbollah. The second thing, which I've already started alluding to, was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And with this revolution, the Islamic Republic created agencies and departments to export that revolution. It was never intended to end at the borders of Iran. Now, Iran was interrupted abruptly from its efforts to export the revolution by the Iran-Iraq War. But it had already started to reach out to other Shia militant minorities across the region. And the most significant one, it was in Kuwait, it was in Bahrain, it was in Saudi. The most significant was in Lebanon because of the size of that Shia community, and more importantly, because of the very, very strong historical, communal, and personal ties between the Shia of Lebanon and the Shia of Iraq and Iran, because of Lebanese Shia clerics traveling to the seminaries, the Shia seminaries in Iraq and Iran, and marrying Shia into Shia families there. So the new Revolutionary Guard sent some 1,500 officers and started training up these Shia from different, small little bands, bringing them under the umbrella of what became Hezbollah and focusing them on Israel. Then, when Hezbollah moved from targeting others in Lebanon or targeting the Israelis to targeting Western interests in those Beirut bombings, for example, first, the U.S. Embassy and the Marine barracks and the French military and a whole bunch of kidnappings, later plots in Kuwait, then in Europe, then in South America. When all of that first started, we now know from declassified U.S. intelligence made public in open court, in federal court here in Washington, D.C., that this was at the behest of Iran, that Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, their version of the CIA, communicated to the Iranian ambassador in Damascus that he should reach out to one of the Mousawis, one of the heads of Islamic Amal, who is becoming the head of Hezbollah, and to instruct him to carry out, quote, a spectacular action targeting the U.S. Marines. And so that relationship between Hezbollah and Iran, which has been constant to today, is really important. It's not the fact that Hezbollah is a proxy of the patron Iran simply because Iran provides it money and Iran provides it weapons. This is a much, much deeper relationship that is ideological. Iranian revolutionary leaders came up with the idea of Walayat al-Faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent, essentially that the supreme leader of Iran is the mouthpiece of God on earth. And while not all Shia believe in that, Ayatollah Sistani and others certainly don't in Iraq, the Hezbollah leaders do. And when they issued that open letter in 1985, they made it very, very clear that they take their marching orders from Tehran.
That's super interesting. So, I mean, that sort of speaks to how the organization really fits into Iran's broader axis of resistance. I mean, can you sort of talk about that concept, the axis of resistance, and sort of Hezbollah's prominence within it? Because it seems like Hezbollah is the primary, child of this axis of resistance. How does it fit into the broader axis, I guess, the broader structure of that, in Iran's thinking around that?
So think of Hezbollah as the crown jewel in the axis of resistance, the first among equals. This is where the Quds Force first established its first main proxy. They go back the longest. They have the strongest relationship. It's the most successful of these projects. And therefore, for many, many years, Lebanese Hezbollah has been called upon by Iran, by the Quds Force, to play supporting roles in the activities of its other proxies throughout the region. Sometimes this has been supplying explosives. So when Hezbollah al-Hijaz, Saudi Hezbollah, carried out the Khobar Towers bombing, targeting U.S. Air Force personnel sleeping in their beds at Khobar Towers in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Ironically, a U.S. Air Force deployment that was there to protect the Shia of southern Iraq. It was Saudi Hezbollah that carried out the plot, but it was Lebanese Hezbollah who provided the explosive and explosive experts. more recently, especially after the killing of Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani. And Qasem Soleimani, of course, was this very kind of dominant, charismatic personality who could, herd the cats and get the various Shia organizations that didn't always play so nicely together in the sandbox to cooperate. When he was gone, they needed someone to play that role, and they reached out to Hassan Nasrallah to do that. And Hassan Nasrallah's main person in Iraq played a very kind of hands-on role, coordinating and mediating between the various Iraqi Shia militias. Now that Nasrallah is dead, this not just Nasrallah is dead, but Hezbollah has been severely gutted. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Hezbollah we knew 2 weeks ago doesn't exist today and probably won't for many, many years, if ever. It's not just a shot at Hezbollah. It is kind of Jenga style, removing several really, really critical bricks from this axis of resistance.
So you mentioned Nasrallah. He just died. That was big breaking news late last week. Who was he? I mean, when you talk about his role in the organization, obviously leader, right? But I mean, is was his power and leadership very centralized? Or, I mean, if he dies, someone else will come and replace him, pretty easily.
Nasrallah was a unique personality, and replacing him is going to be very, very difficult. It is widely assumed that his successor is going to be his cousin and lookalike Hashem Safieddin, the head of Hezbollah's executive council. Safieddin, also has very close ties to the Iranians. He is a longtime Hezbollah leader. He lacks Nasrallah's charisma, and he has very, very, very big shoes to fill. Nasrallah was, a gunslinger in his early youth, and then a cleric, and his supporters loved him. And the others, including Hashem Safieddin, are not likely to engender that kind of emotional support and bond. Hashem Safieddin is also inheriting, a shadow of an organization that's a shadow of itself. Nasrallah built it up, and it's going to be very difficult for any successor to be able to do that, and they'll probably be judged that way too. I should say it's not just that what the Israelis have done over the past few weeks was to take out Nasrallah, and even take out several other key leaders who were there at the very beginning, Ali Karaki, Ibrahim Akil, Fuad Shukr. It's not even a series of decapitations. What we're seeing is open heart surgery. We're seeing tier 2 and tier 3 and tier 4 leaders being targeted. We're seeing equipment being compromised. We're seeing as much as 50%, according to U.S. and Israeli authorities quoted in the New York Times, as much as 50% of their rocket arsenal being destroyed. We're seeing Israeli forces on the ground now, destroying a system of tunnels and storehouses with forward position of weapons to be able to storm into Israel that's been planned for years and years, just being eviscerated. I think that whoever it is that tries to fill Nasrallah's shoes is going to have a very, very, very difficult time doing so. I
mean, I don't know if it's as much of an open heart surgery as it is a heart transplant, except that replacement heart isn't necessarily coming in. But I mean, when we talk about this, I mean, that command structure is being wiped out. The organization, at least in a military sense, is being gutted by the Israeli armed forces. Why did they start launching these rockets on October 8th? Would they not have expected, to have been, just eliminated and wiped out by the Israelis? And I mean, in asking that question, I want to ask about the war in 2006, when Israel was fighting Hezbollah. Why wasn't Hezbollah eliminated in 2006 in a similar way in which it seems to be that their leadership is being eliminated right now?
After the 2006 war, the Israelis had a commission of inquiry, and they were really quite blunt publicly and hard on themselves, appropriately, on how poorly they executed that war. And they've been very public since about how they were completely rejiggering the war plan for the eventual, as they describe it, Third Lebanon War, which I think they would say is what they're experiencing now. That included a complete top to bottom change in how they went about collecting intelligence, what type of intelligence. They've been saying for a long time, if you ask them, trust us, this time, next time, it'll be completely different. I've heard it and over. I had no idea that it was like this. This is something out of a paperback thriller. And they clearly did their homework. And they have not just been dropping bombs, they're taking out very specific targets, they're taking out very specific people. They've been preempting attacks on Tel Aviv. They hit Nasrallah. They took out their command bunker. I think there's also an element of a willingness to do things this time around that they weren't last time. And at the end of the day, more than do things differently in the next war with Hezbollah than we did in the last war with Hezbollah, the real issue here is post-October 7th Israel across the political spectrum. This is not just a Netanyahu thing. Across the political spectrum, Israelis are no longer willing to live with a gun to their head, not from Hamas in the south, not from Hezbollah in the north, mind you, in the context of the Iranian ballistic missile attack, not from Iran either. It put Israel in a position where they were willing to draw on the intelligence homework that they'd done to really strike a decisive blow at Hezbollah. It explains now why the Minister of Defense and others, on October 11th, days after the October 7th attack, 3 days after Hezbollah joined the fray, wanted not to initially focus on targeting Hamas, but on targeting Hezbollah, because they had a real battle plan to just take out that much bigger threat and then turn their focus to Hamas. The order of operations ended up being the opposite. And I think in large part, one reason Lebanese, I think, are very upset with Hezbollah is because on October 8th, they decided in a war of choice to jump in and start shelling Israel on almost daily basis in support of Hamas. And then they made the decision, or Nasrallah made the decision of hooking their caboose to the Hamas train and saying that they would not stop shelling Israel until there was a ceasefire in Gaza. That gave a whole lot more leverage to Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. And whereas there was a period of time where Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was one of the reasons there was not a ceasefire because he didn't want Israeli forces to leave the Philadelphia corridor, the border between Egypt and Gaza, across which there was a lot of smuggling. That was resolved, and senior U.S. officials I've spoken to said the reason there hasn't been a ceasefire for many weeks now is Hamas, as Hamas has moved the goalposts and is demanding the release of much, much more senior, more dangerous Hamas people with more blood on their hands in the first round, probably because they're not expecting a second round of a ceasefire. And they felt emboldened to do that because Nasrallah said he wouldn't stop fighting. And the Israelis have been clear, not for weeks, but for months, that if the U.S.-led diplomatic effort to convince Hezbollah to unhook itself from Hamas and to redeploy its forces 10 kilometers from the border, 10 kilometers is the outer reach of the Cornet anti-tank guided missile, which is the primary, not the only, but the primary weapon they've been firing into Israel over the past 11 and a half months, that if they were able to achieve that through a diplomatic process, great. But if they weren't, then at some point, the Israelis said they would have to redeploy Hezbollah from the border themselves. How they've done that is extremely shocking and surprising, to be sure. The fact that they got to the point where they were going to do that is no secret at all. The Israelis have been saying it to anybody who would listen to the media on a regular basis.
So then, what is the nature of Hezbollah's relationship to Hamas, to other Palestinian militant groups? And as you said, the Israelis sort of made this strategy public. And I'm still struggling to understand, with the way the war in Gaza has gone, just the immense civilian casualties, the brutality of it, like, why did Hezbollah keep launching these rockets? Is there an apocalyptic tendency to their ideology? Do they like sort of anticipate that they're going to be wiped out, or do they think that they can just withstand, that they can actually withstand, this assault through like guerrilla warfare and so on? Like, what is the thinking behind this type of activity?
So the Hezbollah Hamas relationship is goes back a long way. Hamas has offices in Lebanon. Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranians have been running in their term what they described as an operations room, a joint operations room in Beirut, ever since the last Hamas rocket war with Israel 2 years before October 7th. Much of the money that Iran provides to Hamas, as much as $120 million a year by about October 7th, authorities assess, came through Hezbollah. Again, Hezbollah is the first among equals in the axis of resistance, and Hamas, though Palestinian and Sunni, is part of that axis. On the one hand, one can really kind of understand why Hezbollah might want to get involved in this war, but don't allow yourself to connect that to the brutality of war, because Hezbollah started shelling Israel before the IDF went into Gaza at all. Hezbollah started shelling Israel when the only people who'd been killed in this conflict were the Israeli civilians massacred on October 7th. This was not in response to the war, to the way the Israelis have prosecuted the war, to the amount of civilian casualties. Maybe that makes them decide to perpetuate it going on, but that had nothing to do with their decision to do this in the first place. Hamas struck Israel on October 7th. Hezbollah started striking Israel on October 8th. The Israelis went in about a week and a half later. The bigger question, perhaps, is why they haven't done more. They've got 150,000 rockets. They have the capability, well, maybe about half of that now. But at the time, they had about 150,000 rockets. They have the ability to rain 1, 2, 3,000 rockets a day on Israel. And Israel has an incredible four-tiered air defense system, but it can be overwhelmed by volume. They haven't done that. I think that there are two reasons to explain their hesitancy. The first is, let's go back to that economic crisis in Lebanon. I think Hezbollah understood very well that the overwhelming majority of Lebanese did not want full-scale war. Now, Hezbollah had been looking for some time for ways to kind of reassert its resistance credentials. Remember that Hezbollah went and fought in Syria, and about 11,000 fighters, and had to be distracted for several years from fighting Israel. And it was getting hit by its supporters for that. And people were complaining their kids were dying in Syria, being injured in Syria, fighting fellow Muslims. If they were killing Israelis, it's one thing, but this is terrible, people were saying. And Hezbollah really wanted to reassert its resistance credentials. So they were quite happy with the ability to have an excuse to start firing things into Israel, but they really wanted it to be short of full-scale war. And they were trying to figure out where's that sweet spot. What can we do? How much can we do? They were primarily targeting the military, primarily not targeting civilians. They were primarily doing things within a very short range of the border. There was an escalation ladder. They went up and down it a little bit, but they were trying to be restrained while shooting into Israel on a near daily basis. The second reason for this, I think, perhaps counterintuitively, because the Iranians certainly want Israel destroyed. The Iranians certainly support Hezbollah. But the Iranians have been ratcheting up their nuclear program over the past 11 months. And the Iranians wanted the powder dry on the majority of Hezbollah's medium and long-range missiles, because they wanted them available to serve as a deterrent against Israel or anybody else targeting Iran's nuclear program, or if Israel or anybody else did target Iran's nuclear program, as a second strike capability against Israel. And I think that still remains a factor. But those two things, the economic crisis in Lebanon and Iran's needing those rockets, those Hezbollah rockets, to be available as a deterrent against Israel attacking the nuclear program, both contributed to Hezbollah not doing more than it did.
So one thing that's interesting is that, when I've spoken to former, senior intelligence officials like Jim Clapper, for example, when we talked about Hamas, uh, we talked about, like the conduct of the war, just the massive civilian casualties, and like something that Director Clapper said, was that, the nature of this war may lead to more Hamases, more recruits for Hamas, and so on. So we've talked about Hezbollah as a very organized group. And, the leadership's been gutted, but, if this war intensifies, there are more civilian casualties. Do you think that you'd see, I mean, a transition of the group into something like more unorganized, more militant, something similar to, say, like Al Qaeda or ISIS, or like more of a guerrilla group that's getting more recruits? Or do you think that that risk is maybe overblown? I mean, what's your thought on like the recruitment of potentially more fighters into Hezbollah as a result of what's going on? I mean, given especially, Hezbollah's founding, in 1982, during that very brutal Israel-Lebanon war.
So it's we're getting into speculative areas here. Um, on the one hand, Hezbollah already recruits very aggressively and heavily within the Shia community, right? And because of that, for all the losses they've sustained, they still have thousands of fighters, some more capable than others. Um, Most people estimate they at least had about 30,000 active fighters, and then they've got like a reserve unit, a reserve system, like a national army would. It's entirely possible that there could be circumstances in which more people are drawn to Hezbollah, either for ideological reasons or because they are have suffered because of a war with Israel, angry at Israel, or because in the context of war they're getting by only because of Hezbollah's largesse. All of these are possible. It's why I hope that the Israelis stick to what they're saying so far, which is that they've learned their lesson. They don't have intentions of going into Beirut or into the Bekaa Valley or staying for very long. That this really is an operation just to clear out all the infrastructure, really serious, dangerous military infrastructure that Hezbollah has built in villages, meters, sometimes kilometers from the Israeli-Lebanese border, and will then leave. Look, at the end of the day, the Israelis, before all this started with the pagers and everything, the Israeli War Cabinet expanded its war goals from the war goals focused on Hamas in the south to one goal in the north only. That goal is not the destruction of Hezbollah. That goal is not the destruction of as much of Hezbollah's military capabilities, weapons, and infrastructure in the south as possible. It is facilitating the return of the 60,000 plus displaced Israeli civilians who've been kept from their homes in the north for almost a year. To do that, they needed to mitigate the multiple threats Hezbollah poses to the country, in particular to the north. And at the end of the day, nobody in the north was going to go home if all they did is dealt with the rockets and not with the potential for an October 7th style attack across the Lebanese border. This was a Hezbollah plot that they've been working on for years that then Hamas executed in the south. Hezbollah built all kinds of infrastructure specifically for this plot. Just this week, the Israelis made public a series of maps that they found in these bunkers in the south of Lebanon, mapping out where Israeli communities are, where military bases are, what the access routes are, really the exact same type of thing that was found in the bodies of Hamas attackers in southern Israel on October 7th. According to the Israelis, this is how Hezbollah planned to respond to the pager and walkie-talkie attack with a cross-border raid, which the Israelis say they thwarted when they conducted an airstrike and killed Ibrahim Akil and some 15 to 20 other Radwan commanders who had to meet in person to plan this execution because the military communication system had just been compromised. And so I think the Israelis are very focused on the South. And for all the reasons you laid out, I hope they are restrained in what they want to do next and not make this a broader campaign in Lebanon. Wars can go south in lots of different ways. So I'm not going to make a prediction. I'm just going to tell you what I hope.
No, absolutely. And I mean, going back in 1983, You mentioned those Beirut bombings on the barracks. I think President Reagan in his diary said that that day in his presidency was probably the worst day in his administration. And I mean, he pulled out, I think, US troops just within a few months of those bombings. So now I, want to ask about, what is the nature of the U.S. perception on a potential war with Lebanon, perhaps maybe currently or in the past? I mean, obviously the U.S. is helping to shoot down, some of these missiles. We're providing funding to Israel and so on. But like, would there ever be a risk of like direct U.S. involvement, or does the U.S. really not perceive it as being their direct fight per se?
Look, Hezbollah, until 9/11, Hezbollah had more American blood in its hands than any other terrorist organization. And I know people, current and former CIA officials in particular, are doing a jig over the deaths of people like Fuad Shukr and Ibrahim Akil, who played hands-on roles in the 1980s bombings. The bombing of the embassy, I think by luck, the truck car rammed the embassy just beneath where the CIA station was. The CIA's chief Middle East analyst was visiting, really decimated the agency. Later, Hezbollah kidnapped, tortured, and brutally killed a CIA station chief that came to replace the one who was killed himself, Bill Buckley. This goes back. But it's also the case that Hezbollah and Iran are clearly actors that are doing a lot of really destabilizing things in the region. As a country that has real and legitimate concerns and interests in this region, interests of our own, interests on behalf of our allies, by which I don't just mean Israel. Look at the way Gulf states are reacting to the Iranian ballistic missile attack. Look at the way the Iranians have said, if anybody responds to that attack by attacking our oil fields, we will immediately strike oil fields in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. Like, people understand this. The day before the ballistic missile attack, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had a phone call with Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, and the readout from the Department of Defense specifically said that if Iran did attack Israel, there would be, quote, severe consequences. Following the ballistic missile attack, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, reiterated there will be severe consequences. What that means, we don't know and don't speculate. I can tell you that the Israelis have never asked Americans to fight their wars. They've asked for support. They've asked for the ability to have the munitions and stuff to do themselves. I don't think the Israelis are going to be asking America to do the heavy lifting. America may decide that it's in its own interest to finally exact a cost. And I think at the end of the day, without meaning to be too simplistic or pithy, the answer to why does Iran do these types of things, why does Iran carry out external operations like assassination plots and kidnapping plots, even here in the United States and Europe, why does Iran support proxies? Why does Iran pursue a nuclear program? It's because it can, and because the international community has never put in place serious costs. Those costs don't have to be military. They certainly don't have to be all military. They can't only be sanctions. As a former senior Treasury official, I think sanctions have a very important place of all this, but you'll never sanction yourself out of these problems with sanctions alone. Every problem is not a nail, and every solution is not a hammer. We're going to need a collection of tools in the toolkit, and we have to start exacting a cost.
On that note, thank you, Matt, for joining me here today. For our audience, Matt is with the Washington Institute. He is a senior fellow there. And the work he has done that is relevant specifically to this episode on Hezbollah include a book, Hezbollah, The Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God, and then his podcast series, Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule, which really offers a deep dive into this organization. But Matt, thank you so much for joining me here today, and really on such short notice as well, to cover all of these very relevant topics. The news cycle is moving very swiftly, so I'm sure I'll have a reason to bring you back on in the near future. So thank you, Matt.
I look forward to it. Thanks for having me.